There are moments in history that don't announce themselves with noise or warning. They simply break continuity. 3 days ago, something like that happened inside the Vatican, when Pope Leo XIV suddenly vanished from his official schedule without explanation. No public mass, no press statement, no indication of where he had gone or why, just silence from one of the most structured institutions in the world. And when he reappeared a day later, people close enough to see him said he no longer looked the same, as if something unseen had shifted behind his eyes, something heavy enough to change the way a man carries himself in public. Within hours, speculation spread across religious and political circles, but the Vatican offered no clarification, and that silence only deepened the mystery. What makes this even more unusual is not just the disappearance itself, but the fact that Pope Leo XIV has never been a figure associated with unpredictability. Since his election, he has been known for precision, discipline, and tightly controlled public messaging. So when a man like that steps off the map without explanation, it raises questions that the institution around him seems unwilling to answer. To understand why this moment matters, you also need to understand who he is. Born Robert Francis Prevost in Chicago in 1955, he spent years in missionary work in Peru, shaping a form of faith rooted less in institutions and more in lived human experience. When he became Pope on May 8, 2025, many expected stability. Instead, his leadership gradually began to show something sharper, more direct, and less dependent on traditional Vatican caution. In early May this year, during a routine papal briefing cycle, something unusual arrived on his desk. According to multiple accounts, the document did not come through standard Vatican channels. It reportedly originated from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and included archival material that had remained untouched for decades. The contents were linked to one of the most sensitive subjects in modern Catholic history, the third secret of Fatima. Officially, the Vatican had already declared this matter resolved in 2000 under Pope John Paul II, when the text was released alongside a theological interpretation linking its vision to the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. At that time, the Church considered the issue closed, but not everyone accepted that closure. Over the years, theologians and even some clergy quietly suggested that what was released might not have been complete. According to this long-standing claim, an additional written message attributed to the Marian apparition had never been made public. This idea remained unconfirmed but persistent, circulating in academic and religious circles without ever being officially addressed. That changed when Pope Leo XIV reportedly accessed the newly delivered file. What he read inside it has not been fully disclosed, but it was significant enough to alter his movements almost immediately. On May 10, 2026, he arrived in Lisbon under the classification of a private pastoral visit. There was no public announcement, no press delegation, and only a minimal entourage accompanying him. From Lisbon, he traveled by road to Fatima late at night, reaching the sanctuary after it had closed to visitors. He did not arrive alone in a symbolic sense. Waiting there were individuals whose combined connection to the Fatima archives stretched across decades. A retired Portuguese bishop who had worked under multiple papacies, a theologian specializing in Marian apparitions, and a former member of the original Documentation Commission from the 1990s. These were not casual witnesses. They were people directly tied to decisions made long before Leo XIV's papacy began. The meeting that followed inside the Chapel of the Apparitions lasted approximately 4 hours, far beyond normal papal audiences. There is no official transcript, and what was said inside remains unrecorded in any formal sense. But what happened afterward suggests that something decisive occurred in that room, something that immediately influenced what the Pope would say the next morning. The following day, Pope Leo XIV celebrated an unannounced Mass at the Fatima Shrine. Only a few hundred pilgrims were present, along with local clergy and staff. During his homily, he spoke without prepared notes, and his words quickly spread far beyond the sanctuary. He said the Church has a responsibility to truth that does not expire, and that what has been entrusted to it is not meant to be permanently contained. He emphasized that caution has limits and then delivered a line that shifted the entire tone of the moment. He said directly that he had read what he was not supposed to have read and heard what he was not supposed to have heard. That statement alone triggered immediate reaction inside the Vatican. By the same morning, officials were already responding to media pressure and internal concern. A formal clarification was issued, but it carefully avoided addressing the core implication of his words. It neither denied nor confirmed his statement. Instead, it framed his remarks as part of his personal pastoral reflection. Observers familiar with Vatican language immediately recognized that this was not a correction, but a controlled response designed to contain interpretation without confronting the substance of what was said. Behind the scenes, attention turned to the contents of the file Leo XIV had reviewed. According to individuals familiar with the archival material, it contained two major components. The first was a written text attributed to the Fatima apparition, distinct from the well-known vision released in 2000. The second was documentation detailing internal debates about why that text was never made public, including concerns that were less theological and more institutional in nature. These concerns reflected long-standing fears within the Church about the impact of unfiltered prophetic material on institutional stability and public interpretation. For decades, the Vatican had managed Fatima carefully, presenting its message in a structured form that aligned with doctrinal clarity. The challenge with prophecy, however, is that it resists containment. Once released without interpretation, it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty within a global religious institution can quickly expand beyond control. That was the calculation of previous papacies: control the message to protect the structure. But according to Leo XIV's reported reasoning inside the chapel, that calculation no longer holds in a world where information spreads instantly and uncontrollably. This shift in thinking appears to be central to his approach. His argument, as understood by those present, was not that past decisions were malicious, but that they belonged to a different era of communication. In that era, withholding information preserved stability. In the present era, withholding information may actually produce greater instability than releasing it. It is this reversal that may be driving what comes next. Inside the Vatican, reactions are divided. Some see his actions as a necessary correction, long overdue transparency regarding a sensitive historical matter. Others see it as a dangerous departure from institutional caution, with potential consequences that could unfold across the global Church. The concern is not about truth itself, but about timing, interpretation, and the possibility of uncontrolled reactions once sensitive material is fully exposed. What makes this moment even more significant is how it reflects on Leo XIV himself. Throughout his papacy, he has gradually shifted structures, adjusted communication channels, and taken steps that reduce centralized filtering of information. Supporters see this as modernization. Critics see it as destabilization. But both sides agree on one point: this is not a passive papacy. It is one actively reshaping how authority is expressed. As reactions build, the question is no longer only about what happened in Fatima, but about what will happen next. Vatican officials are reportedly preparing further statements, while international bishops' conferences seek clarification. Meanwhile, the possibility remains that the very material once withheld may soon be released in full without interpretive framing. If that happens, it will not just reopen an old theological debate. It will test how a modern global institution handles information that was once considered too sensitive to share. And at the center of that test stands a pope who, for the first time in recent memory, seems willing to let the world see everything exactly as it is, without asking for permission from the systems that once controlled its flow. The story is still unfolding. And what began as a quiet disappearance from a schedule may turn out to be one of the most consequential turning points in modern Vatican history. The journey toward Fatima did not begin with public attention, nor with any official announcement that could be traced through standard Vatican communication channels. It began quietly, almost invisibly, through a chain of internal correspondence that only a handful of people inside the church would ever normally see. According to multiple overlapping accounts, the turning point came when a previously classified file, untouched for decades, was placed directly into the hands of Pope Leo XIV. It was not routine. It was not expected. And most importantly, it did not come from the usual authorities within the Vatican hierarchy. This detail matters because the Vatican operates on structure. Information flows through defined pathways, and even papal access to sensitive material is usually documented, filtered, and contextualized. But in this case, the file reportedly bypassed those normal channels. It came from within the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, carrying material that had long been sealed under strict archival control. The fact that it reached the Pope without institutional framing suggests a deliberate decision by someone within the system to break routine protocol, even if only partially. What the file contained has not been fully confirmed, but consistent accounts point toward material related to the third secret of Fatima, one of the most discussed and controversial revelations in modern Catholic history. Officially, the Vatican declared this secret resolved in the year 2000 under Pope John Paul II, when a symbolic vision was released and interpreted as a reference to historical events, particularly the 1981 assassination attempt on the Pope himself. At that time, the Church presented the matter as complete, finalized, and no longer open to reinterpretation. However, closure in institutional history does not always mean closure in public belief. For years after that release, theologians, historians, and even some members of the clergy continued to question whether the full content had actually been disclosed. The most persistent claim was not about the vision itself, but about a separate textual component that allegedly accompanied it. This component, according to long-standing but unverified accounts, consisted of written words attributed to the Marian apparition, recorded separately from the symbolic vision and never included in the official publication. For decades, this idea remained in a kind of institutional gray zone. It was never confirmed, but it was never fully dismissed either. It existed in academic discussions, in private theological debates, and in cautious references by Vatican observers who treated it as a possibility rather than a fact. That changed when Pope Leo XIV reportedly accessed the newly delivered file. According to individuals familiar with the situation, the material inside did not simply restate known interpretations. It included documentation that suggested internal disagreement within the Church itself about what had been withheld, why it had been withheld, and how those decisions were justified over time. What makes this even more significant is that the documentation reportedly spans multiple papacies. It is not a single moment of decision, but a layered historical record showing how different leaderships within the Vatican approached the same sensitive material under changing global conditions. Some of the reasoning reflected concerns about doctrinal stability, while other parts focused on the potential reaction of the global Catholic population if the text were released without interpretation. In other words, the decision was not framed as suppression for control, but as containment for protection. Yet containment, by its nature, depends on conditions that remain stable. And one of the key arguments now attributed to Pope Leo XIV is that those conditions no longer exist. The world in which information could be carefully managed through institutional channels has fundamentally changed. In the modern environment, silence does not prevent interpretation, it produces it. And interpretation, once uncontrolled, spreads faster and often more chaotically than any official clarification can contain. It was after reviewing this material that the Pope reportedly made the decision to travel. The timing is important. The visit to Fatima was not scheduled publicly, and even internally, it appears to have been classified in a way that limited awareness to a very small circle. On May 10, 2026, he departed for Lisbon under the designation of a private pastoral journey. There was no press coverage, no official Vatican explanation beyond the basic travel record, and no indication that anything unusual was taking place. From Lisbon, the movement toward Fatima was deliberately understated. The route itself is not unusual, but the manner of travel was. Instead of relying on standard ceremonial arrangements or high-profile transport often associated with papal visits, the Pope's convoy moved in a reduced, low-visibility configuration. By the time he arrived at the sanctuary of Our Lady of Fatima, the site was already closed to the public, a detail that ensured complete absence of external observation during the most sensitive hours of the visit. What happened inside the sanctuary during those hours is where accounts begin to converge in significance, even if they differ in detail. It is confirmed that Pope Leo XIV did not enter alone. Waiting within the closed chapel were 3 individuals with direct historical connections to the Fatima archive process. One was a retired Portuguese bishop who had served in sensitive archival roles under multiple pontificates. Another was a theologian whose academic work focused specifically on Marian apparitions and their historical documentation. The third was a former member of the original Fatima Documentation Commission from the 1990s, someone who had been present during internal discussions about what would eventually be released and what would remain sealed. Each of these individuals represents a different layer of institutional memory. Together, they form a continuity of knowledge stretching across decades of internal church decision-making. Their presence in the same room as the Pope at the same time is, by any normal institutional standard, highly unusual. It suggests not a casual meeting, but a deliberate convergence of historical testimony and current authority. The meeting inside the Chapel of the Apparitions reportedly lasted around 4 hours. In Vatican terms, this is extraordinary. Papal audiences, even with heads of state or senior religious figures, are typically far shorter and highly structured. A 4-hour private engagement, particularly in a closed sacred site during nighttime hours, indicates a level of seriousness and depth that goes beyond routine consultation. No official transcript exists. No formal minutes were recorded. What is known comes from partial accounts, indirect confirmations, and the immediate consequences that followed the meeting. And the most important of those consequences appeared the very next morning, when Pope Leo XIV addressed a public mass at the same sanctuary. That homily would become the first visible signal that something significant had shifted during those private hours. But before that moment could be understood, the meeting itself had already set the stage for a decision that appears to have been forming for years, and which at Fatima moved from internal consideration into public expression. By the time dawn approached over Fatima, the atmosphere inside the sanctuary had already shifted in a way that those present would later struggle to describe without hesitation. There was no public announcement, no visible indication of what had taken place inside the Chapel of the Apparitions, yet something about the environment felt altered, as if the weight of the night had not fully lifted. What had begun as a closed, carefully controlled private meeting was already transitioning into something that would soon become public and irreversible. When Pope Leo XIV emerged the following morning, there was no immediate statement explaining the events of the night before. Instead, the schedule moved forward with an unplanned but formally recognized public mass at the Fatima Shrine. It had not been widely announced in advance, which meant only a limited number of pilgrims and local clergy were present. The reduced attendance was not planned for effect, but it created an unusual setting where a global religious moment unfolded in relative quiet, with cameras present, but without the scale of a major papal event. What followed during that Mass quickly distinguished itself from routine papal appearances. Pope Leo XIV did not rely on prepared notes, nor did he follow a carefully structured script typical of high-level Vatican communication. Instead, he spoke directly, with a tone that observers later described as unusually unfiltered for a papal homily. The content of his message, while theologically grounded, carried implications that extended far beyond devotional language. He began by emphasizing that truth within the Church is not something that expires with time, nor something that can be indefinitely adjusted for comfort. He framed responsibility not as a matter of institutional protection, but as a commitment to what has been received, even when that truth is difficult to manage. His words suggested a shift in emphasis, away from containment and toward disclosure, though he did not explicitly announce any formal release of material. As the homily continued, his language became more direct. He spoke about the limits of caution, suggesting that there are moments in history when restraint itself becomes a form of silence that no longer serves its original purpose. For those listening closely, it became clear that this was not a general reflection on theology or tradition. It was a statement shaped by something specific, something recent, and something still not fully disclosed. Then came the moment that changed the entire interpretation of the event. Pope Leo XIV stated, in clear and unambiguous terms, that he had read material he was not expected to read and had encountered information that had not been intended for public exposure. The phrasing was not abstract. It was personal, direct, and unmistakably deliberate. In that instant, the distance between private Vatican decision-making and public acknowledgement collapsed into a single sentence. The reaction among those present was immediate, even if silent. Pilgrims, clergy, and staff reportedly stood in a kind of stunned stillness as the weight of what had just been said began to settle. The significance was not only in the content, but in the position of the speaker. A sitting pope was not referencing tradition in general terms. He was acknowledging direct engagement with restricted material and implying a willingness to act upon it. Within hours, the Vatican's internal communication systems were already responding. By mid-morning, inquiries were being received from bishops' offices, regional conferences, and senior figures within the global church structure. The Secretariat of State issued a carefully worded clarification, but notably avoided engaging with the central claim of the Pope's statement. Instead, it framed his remarks as part of his pastoral reflection and spiritual engagement, a formulation that neither confirmed nor denied the implications of what had been said. For observers familiar with Vatican language, this kind of response is significant in itself. The absence of correction, combined with the presence of carefully neutral phrasing, suggests an institution attempting to manage interpretation rather than directly challenge content. In other words, the response was not designed to resolve confusion, but to contain its expansion. Behind this official response, attention immediately returned to the content of the file Pope Leo XIV had reportedly reviewed. Based on accounts from individuals familiar with the archival material, the file contained two distinct components. The first was a textual element attributed to the Fatima apparition, separate from the symbolic vision released in 2000. This text, according to these accounts, had been preserved under strict archival control and reviewed by multiple popes without ever being made public. The second component was even more sensitive. It consisted of internal documentation detailing how decisions were made regarding the suppression or withholding of certain elements of the Fatima message. This included records of discussion, institutional reasoning, and concerns expressed across different periods of church leadership. Importantly, these concerns were not presented primarily as theological disputes, but as institutional considerations regarding stability, interpretation, and global reception. This distinction is critical. Within the Church, Fatima has never been rejected. It remains an approved apparition, deeply embedded in Catholic devotion. What has always been managed carefully is the interpretation of its most apocalyptic or direct prophetic elements. The concern has historically been that unmediated prophetic material, once fully released, does not remain confined to theological study. It becomes active in public imagination, often in unpredictable ways. For decades, this approach relied on controlled communication. Information could be released selectively, interpreted authoritatively, and framed within established doctrine, but that model assumes a level of informational stability that no longer exists. In the current environment, partial disclosure often generates more speculation than full disclosure would, and silence is quickly filled by external interpretation that cannot be centrally managed. It is within this context that Pope Leo XIV's reported position becomes significant. According to those familiar with the discussions that followed his reading of the file, his argument centered not on challenging past decisions, but on reassessing their relevance. He reportedly suggested that the institutional logic of withholding information may no longer achieve its intended purpose in a world where containment is no longer realistically possible. This perspective marks a subtle but meaningful shift in how authority is being framed. Rather than viewing control of information as a means of protection, it reframes transparency as a form of responsibility. In that sense, the Fatima event is not only about what was read or discussed, but about how the Pope is beginning to redefine the relationship between knowledge, authority, and institutional trust. As reactions continue to develop across the global Church, it is becoming increasingly clear that the homily at Fatima was not an isolated moment. It was a signal. A signal that what was once contained within archives and internal deliberations may now be moving toward a more open phase of engagement, with consequences that are still unfolding and not yet fully understood. After the events at Fatima began circulating through internal Vatican channels, the reaction was not immediate chaos, but something more controlled and arguably more revealing. A careful, measured silence followed by highly selective responses. Inside the institutional structure of the Church, silence is rarely absence. It is often strategy. And in this case, that silence suggested an organization still processing the full implications of what had been said, rather than one ready to publicly challenge it. Behind closed doors, however, discussions intensified quickly. Senior figures within the Vatican began requesting urgent briefings, not only about the homily itself, but about the sequence of events leading up to it. The focus was no longer just on what Pope Leo XIV had said publicly, but on what he had accessed privately and how that access had been possible within existing archival safeguards. That shift in focus marked an important turning point. The issue was no longer purely theological. It had become procedural and institutional. At the center of this attention was the question of the file itself. According to individuals familiar with Vatican archival systems, materials of this sensitivity are typically layered with multiple levels of restriction. Access is not only limited by rank, but also documented through formal approval chains. The fact that Pope Leo XIV reportedly received the file without a standard explanatory framework raised internal questions about whether normal protocol had been bypassed, overridden, or quietly reinterpreted by individuals within the system. As internal inquiries unfolded, attention also turned outward, toward the global Church. Different regional bishops' conferences began responding in noticeably different ways, reflecting existing theological and cultural divisions within Catholicism itself. Some regions expressed cautious support for the Pope's emphasis on truth and transparency, framing his remarks as a reaffirmation of spiritual honesty. Others adopted a more reserved tone, emphasizing the importance of doctrinal stability and careful interpretation, particularly when dealing with material that has historically carried apocalyptic or highly symbolic weight. This divergence in response is not new within the Church, but the Fatima situation has amplified it. What makes this moment different is not only the content of the disputed material, but the position of the person now engaging with it. When theological tension exists at lower levels of the hierarchy, it is often absorbed through institutional dialogue. When it originates from the papacy itself, the structure of that dialogue changes entirely, because there is no higher interpretive authority within the system. Meanwhile, attention also turned to the identities and roles of those present at the Fatima meeting. Each of the three individuals reportedly inside the chapel of the apparitions that night represents a different layer of institutional memory. The retired Portuguese bishop carried decades of internal knowledge regarding Vatican archival practices. The theologian brought academic and interpretive expertise on Marian apparitions, including their historical evolution and doctrinal framing. The former member of the Fatima Documentation Commission represented direct involvement in the decision-making processes of the 1990s, particularly during the period when key materials were being evaluated for public release. Their presence together in a single meeting with the Pope is significant not simply because of who they are individually, but because of what they collectively represent: continuity across decades of institutional handling of a single unresolved issue. In effect, the meeting brought together historical decision-makers, interpretive experts, and current authority in one closed environment without formal mediation. What they discussed inside the chapel has not been officially recorded, but the impact of that discussion is visible in the tone and content of the Pope's subsequent homily. The language he used the next morning suggests not only awareness of the archival material, but also a resolved position on how that material should be treated moving forward. That shift from review to conclusion is what has drawn the most attention inside Vatican analysis circles. One of the most debated aspects of this situation is the apparent change in how authority itself is being understood. Traditionally, the Vatican operates on a model where information is filtered through institutional interpretation before reaching the public. This ensures doctrinal consistency and minimizes the risk of fragmented understanding. However, Pope Leo XIV's approach, as interpreted from his Fatima statements, suggests a different model where authority is expressed through direct communication rather than mediated explanation. This does not necessarily mean abandonment of structure, but it does imply a rebalancing of priorities. Instead of protecting institutional interpretation first and releasing information second, the emerging approach appears to prioritize disclosure first, with interpretation following afterward. This inversion, while subtle in form, has significant implications for how the Church communicates with its global population. Inside the Vatican, reactions to this shift are divided along predictable but increasingly visible lines. One group views it as a necessary adaptation to a modern information environment where secrecy is no longer effective and often counterproductive. From this perspective, controlled transparency is seen as a way to restore credibility and reduce speculation. Another group, however, sees it as a departure from a long-standing institutional responsibility to carefully mediate sensitive theological material in order to prevent misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Both perspectives share a common concern: stability. The disagreement lies in how stability is achieved. For one side, stability comes from openness that reduces speculation. For the other, it comes from careful restriction that prevents uncontrolled interpretation. The Fatima situation has forced these two interpretations into direct tension. At the same time, external attention continues to grow. News of the homily has circulated widely across Catholic media networks, theological forums, and international commentary spaces. The phrasing used by the Pope has been analyzed repeatedly, not only for its theological meaning, but for its institutional implications. Particular focus has been placed on his statement that he had accessed material he was not supposed to read, a phrase that introduces an unusual level of personal acknowledgement into a domain that is typically framed impersonally. This personalization of institutional knowledge is part of what makes the moment so significant. It shifts the narrative from abstract church authority to individual experience within that authority. In doing so, it changes the way responsibility is perceived, not as something distributed across an institution, but as something carried directly by the individual at its highest level. As discussions continue across Vatican departments and global church structures, one fact remains clear: the Fatima event has not concluded. It has opened a process that is still unfolding, with no clear endpoint yet visible. Whether that process leads to formal release of previously withheld material, further clarification, or internal recalibration remains uncertain. What is certain is that the equilibrium that existed before the Pope's disappearance has already changed. And within that change, the Church now finds itself facing not only questions about history, but about how it will manage truth, authority, and communication in a world where none of those concepts remain fixed. In the days following Fatima, the Vatican entered a phase that could best be described as controlled uncertainty. Officially, nothing was declared out of order. Structurally, the institution continued its routine operations, schedules were updated, and normal communication channels remained active. But beneath that surface stability, something fundamental had clearly shifted. Internal discussions became more frequent, more urgent, and noticeably more fragmented as different departments attempted to interpret events that had not been formally defined. What made this period unusual was not a public crisis, but the absence of one. Instead of immediate confrontation or correction, there was delay. Instead of clarity, there were carefully worded statements that avoided direct engagement with the core issue. For observers familiar with Vatican communication patterns, this kind of response is rarely accidental. It usually indicates that the institution is still forming a unified position, especially when the implications of an event extend beyond theology into governance itself. At the same time, attention continued to build outside the Vatican. Catholic communities across different regions began discussing not only what Pope Leo XIV had said, but what it might mean for the future structure of papal communication. For some, his remarks at Fatima represented a long-awaited moment of honesty regarding a subject that had been surrounded by silence for decades. For others, it raised concerns about precedent, particularly the possibility that sensitive historical material could now be released without the traditional layers of interpretation that have always accompanied doctrinal matters. This tension reflects a deeper reality within the Church. It is not only a spiritual institution, but also a historical one, carrying centuries of layered decisions, many of which were made in contexts very different from the present. The Fatima material sits at the intersection of that history and the modern world, where information behaves differently, spreads differently, and is interpreted in real time by global audiences rather than controlled theological frameworks. Within that environment, Pope Leo XIV's position appears increasingly deliberate rather than reactive. His background, shaped by both institutional leadership and lived pastoral experience in environments outside Europe, continues to influence how he approaches authority. Those who have worked closely with him describe a consistent pattern, a preference for direct engagement over procedural delay, and a tendency to prioritize clarity even when it challenges institutional comfort. This approach, however, does not exist without resistance. Within the Vatican, there are still strong voices advocating for caution, emphasizing that the Church's responsibility is not only to reveal truth, but to ensure that truth is received in a way that does not fracture understanding. This is not a rejection of transparency, but a concern about its timing and structure. The underlying fear is not that information would be false, but that it could be misinterpreted once removed from its historical and theological framing. As these internal debates continue, the question of the Fatima material remains unresolved. According to the most consistent accounts, the Pope is still in possession of the archival content he reviewed prior to his visit. Whether he intends to release it in full, partially contextualize it, or continue studying it within internal consultation frameworks is not yet known. What is clear, however, is that the issue is no longer confined to private archival discussion. It has entered the public consciousness of the Church in a way that cannot easily be reversed. There is also a broader implication that extends beyond Fatima itself. The events surrounding Pope Leo XIV's disappearance, his private meeting, and his subsequent homily have collectively raised questions about the evolving nature of papal authority in the modern era. For centuries, that authority has been defined not only by spiritual leadership, but by the management of information, timing, and interpretation. What is emerging now is a model in which authority may increasingly be expressed through openness rather than controlled mediation. If that shift continues, It could mark a subtle but profound transformation in how the Church operates at its highest level. Not a break from tradition, but a redefinition of how tradition is communicated. And that distinction is crucial because it suggests evolution rather than rupture, continuity rather than collapse. At the center of all of this remains a single moment, a private journey to Fatima, a closed-door meeting in a silent chapel, and a homily delivered without notes that quietly acknowledged access to something long kept out of public reach. Everything else, reaction, analysis, division, and interpretation, has unfolded from that moment. In the end, perhaps the most important detail is not what was said or even what was read, but the decision to step forward and speak about it at all. Institutions of great age and complexity rarely change through sudden declarations. They change through accumulated decisions that eventually reach a point where silence is no longer the dominant option. Whether Pope Leo XIV's actions represent the beginning of such a shift, or simply a moment of heightened tension within a long-standing system, is something that time will determine. What is certain is that the equilibrium has been disturbed, and the effects of that disturbance are still unfolding. The story that began with a disappearance from the papal schedule has not resolved. It has expanded, and as the Vatican continues to respond in measured, carefully constructed language, the world continues to watch for what comes next. Because in moments like this, history rarely announces its conclusion. It simply moves forward, one decision at a time, until the shape of what has changed becomes impossible to ignore.